Let me first assure you that I bloody love Star Trek. I've seen every episode of every season of every series at least once, with the exception of TAS and, this thing.
Holy cow! What the hell was that?
Some of my earliest memories are of sitting around the couch with my family watching new episodes of Enterprise as they first aired. No joke, Trip's sister getting eviscerated by an orbital space laser is a formative memory of mine. This franchise is in my blood. So before we address the subject stated in the title of the video, can we just gush about Star Trek for a bit? In my mind, Star Trek is, first and foremost, hopeful. Conceived of in an era with rampant racial inequality, Star Trek dared to put a multiracial crew front and center. And that was just step one. Star Trek imagined a future where humanity had finally united under a banner of peace, exploration, and discovery, no longer bound by the shackles of war or capitalism.
A lot has changed in the past 300 years. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We have eliminated hunger, want, the need for possessions. We've grown out of our infancy.
Sure, the rest of our small slice of the galaxy may have plenty of trouble waiting for us, and we ourselves still have plenty of growing to do, but we can always strive to be our best selves, and in so doing, model a better future for both ourselves and those around us.
It is possible to commit no mistakes and still lose. That is not a weakness. That is life.
I believe I understand, sir.
Some of Trek's best outings are all about that hope. One of the most hopeful episodes in the franchise, one that shows humanity struggling with itself and ultimately finding the kindest, most optimistic path forward, is an episode from Season 2 of The Next Generation titled The Measure of a Man. A trial is held in which Data's status as a person is called into question. A scientist argues that Data is just a thing, an object to be passed around and studied. And maybe, theoretically, some practical scientific good could come around from treating him like so. But I think we can all agree that Picard's arguments hold more sway.
Your Honor, Starfleet was founded to seek out new life. Well, there it sits.
To make a long story short, he quite successfully argues for Data's sentience and in so doing helps set the moral precedent for how humanity should comport itself, by treating all life, manufactured or not, with the same level of respect and dignity as it treats itself. It's a hopeful message, one that shows humanity struggling with itself and coming out the other end better than it started. It's aspirational, showing the best of what humanity can be. As the Big G-Man himself said,
"The whole show was an attempt to say that humanity will reach maturity and wisdom on the day that it begins not just to tolerate, but to take a special delight in differences in ideas and differences in life forms. If we cannot learn to actually enjoy those small differences, then we do not deserve to go out into space and meet the diversity that's almost certainly out there."
It's stories like those, and the fact that they were written by people struggling with those same issues and coming to those thoughtful conclusions that give me hope that maybe, just maybe, humanity does have a bright future ahead of it. Assuming we can get our shit together, of course. On a related note, Trek has also been a vehicle by which its writers can use its science fiction setting as a metaphor for contemporary political and social issues. It and the best science fiction are, as Ursula K. Le Guin put it, descriptive, used to describe and reflect the modern world through speculative concepts. This goes all the way back to the original series, with the third season outing Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, featuring a bloody conflict between two people of the same species, which serves as perhaps the most on-the-nose metaphor for racism perhaps ever committed to screen.
I am black on the right side.
I fail to see the significant difference.
Lokai is white on the right side. All of his people are white on the right side.
This penchant for political commentary continued into Trek's second era. Some of Deep Space Nine's best outings are all about that. Season 3's two-parter Past Tense, for instance, sees some of the crew time-traveling to the distant past of 2024, where rampant inequality has hordes of poor and sick walled off into sanctuary districts, while the rich live comfortably, bleeding them dry, soon leading to mass riots, which for sure has absolutely no contemporary or modern parallels whatsoever. Season 4's Rejoined frames Jadzia rekindling a relationship from a past life as taboo, as a metaphor for contemporary prejudices against homosexuality. And Season 6's Far Beyond the Stars forgoes metaphor entirely with its plot centered on Sisko dreaming of being a science fiction writer in the mid-20th century facing literal, actual racism. What I'm trying to say is DS9 is the best one. And of course, Trek's penchant for political commentary has extended into the modern era. Most notably, in Strange New Worlds, in the Season 2 episode Ad Astra per Aspera, Una gets put on trial by Starfleet for hiding her genetically engineered heritage, which the narrative uses to confront institutionally enforced structural inequality while also pushing back against eugenics.
Genetics is not destiny, despite what you may have been taught. You were not born a monster. You were just born with the capacity for actions, good or ill, just like the rest of us.
It's no accident that Ad Astra is not only the best Strange New Worlds episode, but also the best Trek episode of the whole revival era, which is to say, in decades. And all of that is to say that throughout its whole existence, Star Trek, at its best, has always used its science fiction setting to reflect and comment on real-world issues, and in so doing creates hope for a better tomorrow. Finally, often, Trek is just plain fun.
Fun will now commence.
And I'm not just talking about comedy, though there's plenty of that too.
I protest. I am not a merry man.
What I mean is, it's fun for how comfortable it is. Foundationally, each and every Star Trek show takes its time to slowly ingratiate you with a large, diverse cast of characters, and the fun comes from checking in on your favorite peeps every week, seeing what tomfoolery they got tangled up in this time, and tracking how they slowly develop over tens, hundreds of episodes. We don't love Worf just because funny Klingon man go burr, but because he's also grappling with balancing his heritage with his parentage, with honoring where he came from while still doing right by those who love him now. And also because of how much he tries and fails to be a good dad. We love the Doctor not just because funny Hollow Man go snark, but because him slowly discovering and coming into his own personhood is endearing. A character who starts the show as a mere program grows into a full member of the crew with his own passions for music and holo novels. All of that's to say, there's a million reasons to love Star Trek. It's hopeful, fun, and at its best, socially relevant. And of course, there's so many more things besides just those few points. I'd love to spend more time gushing about it if I could, but sadly that's not the focus of this video. I just wanted to establish a baseline for what Star Trek should look like, as points of contrast for when we finally get into what the title promises. And we will, in just a minute. As much as I love Star Trek in all its various incarnations, I'll be the first to admit it's not perfect. Far from it. With how long it has run, with the sheer quantity of episodes that have been produced over the decades, it was inevitable that some stinkers would sneak onto the air.
I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about.
You know, 1966. 79 episodes, about 30 good ones.
Shit, one might even say that embracing Trek's shortcomings is foundational to loving it, because even in the original series, they had some real doozies in there. Like this one.
Where are you going to look for Spock's brain?
And this one.
Your world of starship captains doesn't admit women.
Star Trek's second era, which was its most consistently great, also had no shortage of episodes you're better off skipping on rewatch. From the TNG crew stumbling upon the racist caricature planet, to the DS9 gang playing hopscotch or something. I don't know, man, that was a weird one. Then, of course, there's the modern era, which has proven, shall we say, divisive. While I will gladly go on record as a Discovery defender and love Lower Decks with all my heart, never before has a Trek show been so consistently middling to downright bad as all 3 seasons of Picard. And while Strange New Worlds has had a few fantastic outings, those also strain to balance against the dreck of the likes of its Do Not Question Starfleet, Put Her Down Like Old Yeller episode, and its racist / pro-eugenics episode. God, fuck man, they really dropped the ball with season 3, didn't they? But before Picard came along and stole the crown for itself, and with any luck will greedily hold onto it for the rest of time, the king of inconsistent Trek shows, some would even argue bad, was, without a doubt, Star Trek Voyager. And don't get me wrong, just like most of the rest of the franchise, I love Voyager. Me and Mariner are of one mind about this.
Oh my god, we get to do something on Voyager!
But it's hard to argue that it holds a candle to its immediate brethren of TNG and DS9. From a sheer quantitative perspective, it produced a greater number of misses than either of its cousins. I want to say combined? Probably more than the 2 of them combined. Its most infamous episode is probably the second season outing Threshold, threshold, where through some sci-fi mumbo-jumbo, Tom Paris gets turned into a salamander before kidnapping Captain Janeway and having little salamander babies with her. And side note here, but I feel like I never see it remarked upon how fucking weird it is that the first Star Trek show which features a female captain as the protagonist has said captain get kidnapped and forced to have children without her consent. That's not good, y'all. But the fun times don't end there. How about the episode where Harry Kim lands on a planet full of evil women who want to bone him? Or how about the 2 Fairhaven episodes from season 6, which can be generously described as tokenizing Irish culture? But I can't make myself be too mad at those episodes. After all, the first one has what is quite possibly Janeway's single greatest line, maybe that of the entire show. After flirting with a holographic bartender, only for the bartender's wife to come up, Janeway starts tweaking the bartender's appearance to her preferences, then does this.
Delete the wife.
Honestly, 10 out of 10, no notes. Delving into exactly why Voyager was the most inconsistent Trek show of its era is a bit beyond the scope of this video, but suffice to say that after a strong pilot, the show's inability to take full advantage of its premise and often stagnant characterization did it no favors. Nor was it helped along by a recurring plotline of an adult-ass man dating someone who is, and this is true, 3 years old! I feel like it's not a coincidence that the ejection of that plotline and the exiting of said 3-year-old to usher in Jerry Ryan's 7 of 9 marked the moment where Voyager grew its beard, or at least a respectable stubble. With the exception of that unfortunate pandering bodysuit, with 7, the show suddenly felt fresh and dynamic in ways it just hadn't previously. With 7, the show had a dynamic character who was constantly evolving, learning what it meant to be human, helped along by the show's previous breakout star, the holographic Doctor, who previously went on and continued to go on such a journey. It's no exaggeration to say that the bulk of Voyager's best outings center on 7, and without her, the show would almost certainly have ground to a halt before the crew found their way home. Which is what makes it so unfortunate that the worst episode of the show, and by extension the worst episode of Star Trek ever, also happens to center her. We're talking about Season 4, Episode 17, Retrospect. To somewhat undercut my premise a little, when I call this the worst episode of Star Trek ever, what I mean is it's the episode I hate the most. Of all the morally questionable to borderline socially abhorrent shit we've highlighted so far, from the kidnapping of Janeway to the eugenics nonsense of Strange New Worlds, this is the only episode that makes me actively angry. You could make an argument that from a purely technical perspective, regarding how the script builds tension and the camera work and whatnot, this isn't as bad as some of that other stuff, but I don't care. This shit pisses me off, and for however long it takes, I'm going to let you know exactly why. But first, what is this episode about? To make sure we're all on the same page, I am going to first try to recount as concisely as I can, with as little editorializing as I can manage, the exact plot of this episode. Retrospect begins with Voyager blowing up some satellite. It's a weapons test, and this guy, Koven, is trying really hard to sell Janeway on his big fancy cannon. Janeway, being a big fan of big booms, is like yes please, and then assigns 7 to help oversee the installation. At this point in 7's arc, she's recently violated Janeway's trust, and Chakotay advises her to earn it back one step at a time. So, despite not liking the guy, she agrees. Then, the two butt heads over the installation, and he gets verbally hostile and tries to manhandle her out of the way, in response to which she decks him in the face. Cue title sequence. Koven whines to Janeway about 7 being mean to him, and the Doctor, bless his holographic heart, really couldn't give a shit.
It's a miracle you survived. Now hold still or this won't heal properly.
Janeway, in turn, tries to meet 7 where she is, presenting herself as empathetic while also imparting a lesson about not acting on impulses. Later, the Doctor's examining 7, who seems unusually distressed by his proximity. Then, quite unusually, panics upon being strapped down to the medical table. Intrigued, the Doctor does some therapy on her, and that procedure uncovers some repressed memories. Turns out, back on their previous away mission, Koven attacked 7 and performed an invasive procedure to steal her Borg tech. In 7's exact words,
"He violated me."
Oh boy. The Doctor, incensed, immediately takes this to Janeway, Tuvok, and Tom Paris, using some technobabble to argue that 7's memories are reliable.
There's no doubt that Seven was the victim of a brutal assault.
Oh boy.
Tuvok and Paris express doubt, but Janeway takes the accusations seriously and orders an immediate investigation. Both she and Tuvok interview Koven, who angrily denies the charges, and now he's worried for his own future, because among his people, even getting accused of such a crime can ruin one's career. Tuvok assures him that their investigation will be impartial, and Koven says he believes him. Meanwhile, the Doctor helps Seven get in touch with her human emotions, leading to the realization that she is in fact angry and wants justice. Later, in the presence of an overseer from Koven's people and Koven himself, the Doctor and Tuvok examine Koven's lab and seem to find evidence corroborating Seven's story. Koven, feeling betrayed by Tuvok, freaks out, pulls a weapon on them, then beams out and flies away on his ship. Voyager gives chase, but he confounds their sensors for a bit to get a head start. While Voyager races to catch up, Janeway and Tuvok examine the evidence they gathered and find that it, in fact, doesn't say Koven is definitely guilty. Seven doesn't take that news well. Janeway tries to talk her down, wonders if maybe her traumatic memories from her time as a Borg got mixed up, but Seven's pissed and ain't having any of that, insisting that Koven is guilty and must face justice. Then, Voyager finally catches up with Koven. Janeway tries to hail him and say sorry, but he's having none of it, turns around, and fires everything he has at Voyager, trying as hard as he can to kill them all. Janeway completely refuses to open fire on him, even in self-defense, and instead tries to have him beamed over. But before that can happen, Koven fires his weapon so hard that they overload and blow up, scuttling his ship and killing him. After, Seven and the Doctor talk about guilt and remorse. It's a feeling Seven doesn't like and wants to get past as soon as possible. But the Doctor tells her she'll have to live with it. But he doesn't want to live with it himself, so he asks Janeway for permission to roll back his program to factory settings. But she tells him no. They all have to live with the guilt of getting an innocent man killed. It's their collective responsibility for rallying around Seven and letting their good intentions blind them. The end. Okay, so that was a lot. Before we tear it to shreds, though, let me try to give this episode as much credit as I can. I like that bit of snark from the Doctor after the opening credits, of course, but aside from that, I love Janeway's response when she goes to confront Koven and he gets all snappy.
Are you willing to risk our trade agreement all on the basis of one crew member's delusions?
Yes.
Thank you!
Good, that's good. When someone confides in you that they've been hurt, they are demonstrating a deep trust in you, and so in order to do right by them, it's your duty to, in turn, be there for them however you can, whether that entails simply comforting them or advocating for them to others. Janeway demonstrates this principle perfectly with that curt, concise response. Seven's been hurt, and she's going to do everything in her power to see that justice is done on Seven's behalf, no matter the bridges she has to burn. That is good leadership and good friendship. Janeway could murder me, and I'd say thank you. And that's it. That's the only positive thing I have to say about this episode. And it's not much, because if you couldn't tell, the rest of the episode does everything it can to shred what little goodwill was bought by that one scene. So, there's a lot to unpack here. There are two lenses through which you can analyze this narrative. Staff writer Brian Fuller's stated intent of exploring contemporary fears of how false memories and accusations can ruin lives, or a more modern understanding of how abusers perpetuate narratives like those to downplay the harm they cause. In other words, one's interpretation of this episode can change whether you believe Koven or Seven. And for the record, I'm on Seven's side, and it's viewing the narrative from her perspective that really wrestles my jimmies, but for the sake of balance, it's also worth examining the writer's stated intent. No matter which perspective you approach this narrative from, though, this episode fails to say anything meaningful about either, and that boils down to its ambiguity in what actually happened and its refusal to take a side. So let's first talk about how the episode does that, then we can start analyzing the narrative from those two contrasting perspectives. First, the ambiguity. This episode creates ambiguity by refusing to clearly illustrate what actually happened between Seven and Koven. To show how it does this, we have to look at two scenes near the climax. First is the evidence analysis. Keep in mind that this scene comes immediately after the one where Koven held Tuvok and the Doctor at gunpoint before firing a flashbang.
He generated a photonic pulse.
Right, that firing a photonic pulse at Voyager and fleeing. So at this point, if we're not already on Seven's side by default, we're very much primed to view Koven with suspicion. Koven. In this scene, Janeway and Tuvok are analyzing the evidence they gathered from Koven's lab and aren't able to find anything conclusive. They run a technobabble experiment whose results provide an alternative explanation for what might have happened, but still isn't conclusive one way or the other.
The nanoprobes are regenerating in exactly the same pattern we saw in Koven's laboratory. It appears to be a spontaneous response, which could have been caused by the energy released from the Thoron weapon.
Setting aside the technobabble, there is one key word there that's the linchpin for this whole ordeal. Could. The doctor says that alternative explanation could have happened. None of them know for sure. The evidence is still ambiguous, not telling them anything for certain one way or the other. This ambiguity is then further solidified by the episode's climax, where Koven blows himself up, and any hope for answers is destroyed with him. On its own, this climax is a cop-out. Janeway is not forced to make the choice between believing her crew member and the man she accused of hurting her, and so the episode handily avoids having to take a position on any of the issues it raises. If you take the writers at their word, this ambiguity causes this episode to fail as an explanation of false memory due to Koven's unsympathetic portrayal, and if viewed from a more modern lens of victim advocacy, this ambiguity does wrong by 7 at every turn. Let's look at Koven first. If you were to take staff writer Brian Fuller at his word, Koven is intended to be the more sympathetic figure here. According to him, the goal of this episode was to explore contemporary fears about how something called false memory syndrome apparently ruined a lot of lives. As he stated in an interview with the official Voyager magazine, "We hear so much about how they can essentially ruin people's lives, how well-respected and credited doctors have been completely dethroned, how teachers and parents have been humiliated." Very briefly for context, or I suppose not so briefly, I'm sorry, what the hell is he talking about? False memory syndrome is a psychological concept which purports to describe a phenomenon wherein traumatic memories recovered during therapeutic processes turn out to be false. In the mid to late 90s, there were several cases where recovered memories were an issue of contention in lawsuits, which resulted in medical practitioners losing their jobs. Most notable was the case of Dr. Bennett Braun, who was accused of criminal negligence in cajoling his patients to remember cases of childhood abuse and satanic ritual worship. I must note that the concept of false memory syndrome is at best contentious, to the point where it's not even listed in the DSM. That is, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Illnesses. Probably should have led with that. So using that as the basis for a forward-thinking episode of science fiction television was already a questionable idea. But on top of that, in running with that concept, the episode entirely loses the plot regarding what those cases were actually about. They were primarily about doctors losing their jobs due to alleged medical malpractice. Cases about unrelated third parties getting caught in the crossfire due to well-meaning doctors just trying to do their jobs were at best rare. In the most prominent of such cases I could find, that of Gary Ramona in 1994, Ramona successfully sued his doctor's daughter for monetary damages after said doctor helped his daughter recover memories of her father abusing her, claiming that those memories were false. On the surface, that would appear to be a pretty clean match for Koven's case, with a doctor spurring a young woman to recover false memories which ruin a man's life. However, there's actually a bit more nuance to that case, where the jurors admitted to not believing that the doctor's daughter implanted the memories, nor did they buy into Ramona's crocodile tears. Getting into further details about that case is beyond the scope of this video and extremely fucking depressing, but suffice to say there's numerous indications that Ramona was not an innocent victim, and yet that case served as a flashpoint for people accused of such crimes using false memory syndrome as a defense. The point of discussing all that contemporary social context is to establish that using false memory syndrome as the basis for an episode of Star Trek, as was the writer's intent, was at best an ill-conceived notion. Its usefulness and validity as a psychological concept has been met with endless skepticism, and its applications in courtrooms have been varied and inconsistent, from holding doctors accountable for causing harm to trying to protect the reputation of people accused of abuse. None of that maps cleanly onto Retrospect thanks to its inability to commit to the truth of the incident between Seven and Koven's generally unsympathetic portrayal. But you know what? For the sake of argument, let's give the writers the benefit of the doubt. Let's assume that false memory syndrome is a legitimate, pressing concern. Hell, let's abstract it and just boil it down to the bare essentials. The writers of this episode were really worried about people getting accused of crimes they didn't commit, and so tried to make a Star Trek episode out of that fear aimed at exploring and validating such concerns. Did they do a very good job of it? Well, let's try to put ourselves in the shoes of just such a person. Let's watch this episode pretending that we're someone in jail for a crime we didn't commit. And for whatever reason, the Warden is letting us watch Star Trek Voyager. How is watching this episode going to make us feel? Very poorly, I imagine. We might feel a twinge of sympathy for Koven at the start as he starts shouting in his own defense, but quickly his persistent petulance turns grating, which risks evaporating that sympathy. From there, we start to get frustrated with the guy as he becomes increasingly unhinged. He takes no action to prove his innocence. Instead, he engages in increasingly violent acts, first holding Tuvok at gunpoint before, and I cannot stress this enough, trying to blow up Voyager and everyone on it! If this episode was meant to portray the victims of false accusations in a sympathetic light, then it fails in that goal because at no point does the script do anything to show Koven in a sympathetic light. Rather, it paints him as increasingly villainous, all while refusing to confirm whether or not he was actually guilty of the initial crime. In the scenario where you and I, dear viewer, are watching this as ourselves people who are supposed to relate to him, I can only imagine us getting increasingly pissed off as this episode portrays people like us as psychotic maniacs who will resort to attempting mass murder because we lost our jobs. So, from every angle you approach it at when trying to analyze this episode from the lens of the false memory phenomenon, Retrospect fails to say anything meaningful. From misrepresenting how the idea of it has actually historically been employed, to failing to treat the people it allegedly affects with any degree of empathy. But that's not even the half of it, because that's not the lens that got me riled up about this episode to begin with. There's the other side of the equation, isn't there? The other perspective, which is, in my eyes, far more damning. When viewed from the perspective of 7 of 9, when analyzing this episode through the lens of victims of abuse who come forward, this episode gets much, much worse. In the decades since this episode has aired, there's been a broad cultural shift in how we as a society view victims of abuse. Today, we're much more aware of how disgustingly common sexual abuse is and how and why it's so difficult for victims of abuse to come forward, namely, fear of being disbelieved. And the stories we hear and tell, both real life and fictional, can directly influence that culture. When an abuse victim sees another being disbelieved, suddenly it's that much harder for them to come forward for fear that the same will happen to them. And this episode, even if unintentionally, plays right into that. I say unintentionally because, per that same interview with Brian Fuller, the writers tried to disassociate their plot from the plight of abuse victims. Quote, "We were trying to distinguish it from a TV movie about date rape. We removed the sexual elements." I must unfortunately report that they completely failed in their attempt to do that, with lines like,
"He violated me." There's no doubt that Seven was the victim of a brutal assault.
This episode constantly frames Seven as a victim of assault. Ergo, we must view her and analyze the episode through that lens. And when we do, we find that the episode fails to meaningfully comment on the plight of victims by reinforcing the narrative wherein their stories are minimized and discarded. To show how the episode does that, let's take a look at a few key scenes. The first scene of note is when the Doctor brings Seven's plight to the attention of Janeway, Tuvok, and Paris. And while Janeway's approach is measured, Tuvok's is distinctly less so.
You seem to be accepting Seven's recovered memories as fact.
Are you suggesting otherwise?
Historically, recovered memories have often proven unreliable. Human memory is rarely perfect.
Woof, Tuvok. So let's first acknowledge what the scene is trying to accomplish. It's trying to evoke the false memory phenomenon in order to establish the conflict that will carry the rest of the episode. But, when viewed through the lens of victim advocacy, the security officer's skepticism here takes on a more sinister undertone. Rather than reading as skepticism, it reads as dismissal of the victim's narrative. The reason victims of abuse are so often hesitant to come forward in the first place is because they fear being disbelieved. And here, Tuvok does just that. In reframing the issue from discussing whether Koven is guilty to discussing whether Seven is a reliable witness to her own abuse, this scene starts the process of portraying the narrative wherein victims of abuse are disbelieved in favor of their abusers, and in so doing, the episode reinforces that narrative as the likely outcome in the minds of viewers who might need to hear otherwise. I'm not saying that someone who's been accused doesn't deserve due process. Anyone accused of a crime should naturally be afforded an impartial investigation, like Tuvok attempts to do. What I'm saying is that the way he immediately jumps to skepticism can be read as victim dismissal, where a more thoughtful, neutral investigator, would have instead started planning how to conduct an impartial investigation. The next key scene comes when Tuvok goes to question Kovan about what happened. Tuvok is calm and measured in his approach, where Kovan is not.
There's nothing for me to confess. I haven't done anything wrong.
He panics at what all of this is going to do to his poor reputation.
On my world, we depend on trade with alien species. There are strict protocols about those relationships. Even being accused of violating them is a serious offense.
The function of this scene is to once again reframe the main conflict, distract from the primary issue. Now, instead of being about whether Kovan did it, this scene tells us that actually, we're supposed to be sympathetic with Seven's abuser, because what about his reputation?
I won't be trusted any longer. I'll be ruined.
This framing asks the viewer to weigh the value of the well-being of a victim of abuse versus the reputation of their alleged abuser, as if that is in any way a legitimate comparison, as if there is any equivalence to be drawn between the two. But there isn't. One's reputation is fleeting, just as easily built up as it is knocked down. As long as you're alive and well, you can build it up again. But the trauma from abuse, even with the best treatment, the scars it leaves can linger for life. Thus, the framing of a victim's pain versus an alleged abuser's livelihood is a false equivalence. And yet, through this scene, with the time spent hammering home how much this point definitely matters, combined with Michael Horton's admittedly passionate performance, this episode would have the viewer believe that those two things do carry equal weight. And the fucked up thing is, that exact sort of argument is the exact kind of thing abusers employ to protect themselves, and it often works. Just as people would rather Johnny Depp keep making movies than believe that a man with a documented history of substance abuse and abrasive behavior could possibly do a single bad thing to his partner, so too do the cast of Voyager not just lend Kovan the benefit of the doubt, but actively champion his cause, even without solid motivation to do so. Which segues nicely into the final scene of note, the evidence analysis. We've already discussed how this scene creates ambiguity, or rather, refuses to provide a clear answer about what really happened. In returning to this scene, though, we must also consider how this looks from the perspective of the victim, of Seven. At this point in the narrative, all that Janeway and the rest have to go on is Seven's word versus that of Kovan's. And what do? Make the active choice to believe Kovan, the man who pointed a gun at them and fled from them, over Seven, a trusted member of the crew who herself is trusting them to do right by her. And they don't. They fucking don't. These are the people who Seven trusts most in the universe, and when given the choice between taking her word and that of a stranger's, they choose a stranger's. They value a stranger's word over the physical and mental well-being of their own crew member. Within the context of the narrative itself that paints the crew as unusually cruel and, dare I say, illogical. The ambiguity of what really happened does not at all serve the narrative here because, absent of conclusive evidence one way or the other, one would think that Kovan pulling a gun on them and firing at their ship would make them default to Seven's side, if they weren't already on it. By refusing to do so, the episode communicates that maybe victims shouldn't be believed, that maybe they are making it up. It plays right into that snake oil that abusers try to sell to paint themselves in a more positive light. This scene is thus the culmination of every bad idea about the abuser-victim dynamic this episode as a whole is steeped in, portraying the abuser with unearned sympathy while minimizing the plight of the victim and validating their fears about being disbelieved when disclosing their abuse. With that in mind, I invite you, once again, to perform the same exercise that we once did with Kovan. Put yourself in the shoes of a victim of abuse. You've been continually hurt by someone, but for one reason or another, you've been afraid to come forward and speak your truth. Now imagine turning to your favorite show ever, Star Trek, for comfort. Oh boy, this episode's about your favorite character, 7 of 9. You wonder what fun adventures she's getting up to this week. Then, surprise, this episode starts using charged language, painting her as a victim of abuse. Suddenly you're relating to her more than ever before. In her, you see yourself, and when she demands justice, maybe you start to hope. But wait a minute. Her crew members start disbelieving her? Taking her attacker's side? How is that going to make you feel? Like shit, I imagine. If this is the story we're telling about victims, that they're just making it up and shouldn't be believed because what if we end up hurting their poor innocent abusers, then that's just going to make them even less likely to come forward, for fear that they'll be treated just like 7 of 9, their perspectives tossed aside in favor of abusers who never earned it. In other words, the overall narrative framing fails to treat its victim of abuse with anything in the way of compassion, in so doing failing to make any meaningful statement or provide any worthwhile insight into how society and those in power should handle assault and abuse. That, more than anything, is what really makes this episode the worst. So all of that's pretty goddamn awful, and all of that alone is enough for me to consign this episode to the deepest pits of hell.
Cast it into the fire!
But that's not all that's wrong with it. No. So remember the whole extended introduction of this video where I established a framework for a solid Star Trek episode? Surprise. That wasn't for nothing. We've been working in that framework the whole time. The previous segment was focused on addressing one point of that framework, how Trek is often politically and socially relevant. By now, I hope I've thoroughly illustrated how this episode failed at that point, but there's still the other two to address, fun and hope. Let's take those one at a time. First, fun. As a quick refresher, Trek is fun because it gets you invested in a diverse cast of fleshed out characters that you get to return to week after week for months on end. Since this episode is primarily about 7 of 9, we would hope that it would do something meaningful with her character, further develop her personality, or help her further grow into her burgeoning humanity. Does it do that? I think you can guess the answer. This episode just doesn't make sense as a story for 7, either on a micro or macro level. It opens with Chakotay telling 7 that she has to earn Janeway's trust back. So, 7 tries to do just that by being honest and open with first the Doctor, then everyone about the abuse she suffered, only to have her trust betrayed when Janeway tries to tell 7 she was wrong to accuse Coven.
You were the one who helped me to understand what happened, and now you're denying it.
So then, taken on a micro level, the lesson teed up by the episode's opening about trust falls flat, because the trust 7 demonstrates is met with disbelief and betrayal.
Betrayal!
If 7's supposed to learn any lesson from this ordeal, what logically can she take away other than that opening yourself up to others just leaves you open to being stabbed in the back? Extrapolating that to the macro level, that is, trying to apply this to 7's overall arc about coming into her own humanity, this could only serve to seed in her a deep distrust of others, make her more hesitant to open up to people when she really needs to. Based on all of that, this episode fails as a 7-centric adventure, and so fails the point on the framework of being a fun weekly outing. Finally, does this episode give me hope? Obviously not. Failing the socio-political point of the framework sort of invalidates this one by default. But don't worry, there's extra bits here to dissect. Specifically, the morals this episode tries to end with are just about the least hopeful messages I think a Trek episode has ever communicated. First, there's a bunch of moralizing about how everyone had a hand in Coven's death and that guilt is something they'll all have to live with for the rest of their lives. To drive this point home, Janeway says,
"We all rallied around 7, Doctor, myself included. I wanted her to know that she was part of this family, that we would support her, fight for her, no matter what. We let our good intentions blind us. We all bear responsibility for Coven's death, and we all have to live with it."
Kate Mulgrew's tone in her delivery of that speech is imbued with regret, as if Janeway wishes she could take it all back. But here's the thing, they did nothing worthy of regret. Rallying around 7, around someone who trusts you, is in fact a good moral thing to do. And moreover, they took no direct action to cause Coven harm. At every given opportunity, Janeway ordered against firing at Coven's ship, no matter how hard he tried to blow them up. So persistent is she in trying to de-escalate that it comes off as irrational for putting Voyager in danger.
We must protect ourselves! Disable his ship!
No!
Coven only died because he refused Janeway's repeated offers of peace. He overloaded his weapons and blew himself up, and so only has himself to blame. This lesson about living with guilt making you more human falls flat because they cannot reasonably blame themselves for an idiot offing himself. But wait, there's more. This episode also tries to shoehorn in some lesson about not sticking your nose in someone else's business, which also falls flat.
In my enthusiasm to help 7 of 9, I lost my medical objectivity. I became a self-righteous advocate and didn't stop to think for 1 second that I might be wrong.
This is nonsense because advocating for one's patient is, in fact, his job. I find it really difficult to object to someone whose first instinct upon being confided in about abuse is to help them. By framing the doctor as having gone too far in his advocacy, the episode tries to equate the air quotes harm that such advocacy could cause with the actual literal harm done by the abusers, which such advocacy pushes back against. But guess what? Those two things are nowhere near the same. Standing up for people who've been wronged is good, actually. You should, in fact, do that. And any harm that falls upon abusers as a result is not your burden to bear. Advocating for someone who's been hurt is not the same as hurting. It is, in fact, the exact opposite. But by pretending they're the same, this episode becomes the literal embodiment of a fucking dril tweet.
The wise man bowed his head solemnly and spoke. There's actually zero difference between good and bad things. You imbecile. You fucking moron.
And if that doesn't suck all the hope right out of your bones, I don't know what will. So while this episode as a whole is a wash, let's be clear. An episode using sci-fi gizmos to non-consensually fuck with someone's memories is absolutely a valid idea. It's not one this episode explores at all, but it can be done. In fact, it has been done, way back in TNG. It's called The Inner Light. You hardly need me to recount the plot of that episode, right? Picard gets blasted with some weird light from a probe, then spends the rest of the episode living the memory of a long-extinct species. And this experience permanently changes him, as shown by him keeping the flute he learned to play in those memories as a memento which he carries throughout the rest of the show. Picard didn't agree to have his memories messed with, but the episode nevertheless manages to stay true to Star Trek's core ideals by being hopeful and having a meaningful emotional impact on Picard. This species of people may be lost, yes, but thanks to their ingenuity, their memory lives on, and Picard's left melancholic yet wiser for being the only person in the galaxy with the memories of the lives and culture of that long-gone people. This episode thus uses sci-fi memory manipulation as the vehicle by which to deliver a message about hope in the face of certain doom. That is how you do it. Not by calling the main character's memory into question via technobabble as an excuse for excusing abuse. Between all of that, Retrospect fails miserably at every key factor that makes up a good Star Trek episode. In attempting to address contemporary fears about a questionable pseudoscience, it wound up presenting a harmful narrative that reinforces toxic ideas about abusers being the real victims who don't deserve to have their lives and careers and reputations damaged, at the expense of the victims of their very real abuse. In so doing, portraying much of the cast of Voyager in a deeply unsympathetic light. Thanks to all of that, this episode sits comfortably as my most hated episode of Star Trek ever. But hey, that's all just like my opinion, man. Retrospect may be the episode of Star Trek that rustles my jimmies the most, but it is merely one of a pantheon of ill-conceived outings. So, what do you think? Is this episode sufficiently awful to warrant being ejected directly into the sun, or is that one that gets even deeper under your skin? Tell me all about it in the comments. Maybe I'll talk about it in the future if there's demand for it, or maybe I'll cover some good Trek. Instead, that'd be easier. This episode was so fucking hard to write. Jesus Christ, you have no idea. Well, good or bad, whatever happens next, the only way to find out is to stay tuned. So do that, and I'll catch you in the next one.